They exiled her at 13 for lying about the lung-freezing air. Einar Moen, who had survived 11 Dakota winters, said it plainly. She'll find her little brother frozen solid in that dirt hole with her. She had $4, a 7-year-old brother, and needed 8 cords of firewood she could not cut. On January 12, 1888, temperatures dropped 60 degrees in 5 hours. But 5 months earlier, Thea Solvang had never dug anything deeper than a potato furrow in her life. She arrived in Buford Crossing, Dakota Territory, on a March morning when the mud was so thick the wagon wheels sank to their axles. Her father Henrik walked ahead with a shovel, prying the wagon free every 50 feet. Her mother Kirsten sat in the back, holding 7-year-old Anders, trying to keep him warm under a quilt that was already soaked through. The land they'd bought sight unseen, 160 acres at the confluence of the Missouri and Yellowstone rivers, turned out to be mostly clay bluffs and buffalo grass. Henrik's brother Petter had written glowing letters about the soil, the opportunity, the neighbors who helped each other. What Henrik found when he arrived was a half-built sod house, a brother's grave from the winter before, and a community that looked at newcomers the way wolves look at wounded deer. They had spent almost everything on the land and the journey. Henrik counted what remained, $47. Enough for seed, basic tools, and provisions until the first crop came in. If nothing went wrong, everything went wrong. Henrik caught pneumonia in May digging the root cellar in a cold rain. He was dead by June, buried next to his brother on the bluff behind the property. The crop never got planted. The sod house roof remained unfinished, timber rafters without proper covering, gaps that would let in snow. By August, Thea counted what remained of what remained, $4.30. A 7-year-old brother who didn't understand why Papa wasn't coming back. A mother who hadn't risen from bed in 6 weeks, who stared at the ceiling and sometimes forgot Thea's name. And winter coming in 10 weeks. The general store in Buford Crossing sat at the center of everything. Post office, bank, social club, and court of law, all in one unpainted building. Einar Moen owned it, and therefore owned the settlement's opinion on most matters. He'd survived 11 Dakota winters. He'd lost 2 fingers to frostbite in the hard winter of 1881, when the train stopped running for 5 months, and people burned their furniture to stay alive. When Einar Moen said something about cold weather survival, people wrote it down. Thea walked the 3 miles to the store on an August morning, her best dress still showing the mud stains from her father's funeral. She waited until the other customers left. Then she approached the counter. "I need supplies on credit," she said. "Flour, salt pork, beans, and materials to repair our roof. I can pay after harvest." "What harvest?" Moen didn't look up from his ledger. "Your father never planted." "I'll work. I'll hire out to other farms. I can pay by—" "You're 13 years old." Now he looked up. His eyes moved over her like he was appraising livestock. "You have a mother who won't rise and a brother who can't work. Your father was a good man, but he was green. He didn't finish that roof. He didn't cut enough wood. He didn't store enough food." "I know what we don't have. That's why I need credit." Moen closed his ledger. "Let me explain something to you, girl. A Dakota winter requires 8 cords of firewood minimum. Your sod house has gaps a cat could walk through, so you'd need 10. You have 2 cords, green cottonwood your father cut before he died, which will smoke more than it burns. You need 400 pounds of flour, 100 pounds of salt, 50 pounds of beans. You have maybe 60 pounds of flour and whatever you didn't eat last month." He leaned forward. "A girl cannot do what a grown man couldn't finish. You understand? The numbers don't work. You can't cut 6 cords of wood and nurse an invalid and mind a child and repair a roof and store food and keep a fire burning all winter. A grown man with 2 working hands couldn't do all that alone. You're a skinny girl with nothing but a shovel." "Then what am I supposed to do?" Put your mother and brother on the stage to Bismarck. The church there takes charity cases. As for you, find a family that needs a hired girl. You're strong enough for that." He opened his ledger again. "This claim is finished. If you stay here, you'll die here. All three of you." Thea stood there for a long moment. The store was empty. No one to see her shame. "I'm not putting my family on a charity stage," she said finally. Moen shrugged. "Then you're putting them in the ground. Makes no difference to me." She walked the 3 miles home in the August heat, counting steps to keep from crying. 8 cords of firewood, 400 pounds of flour, 10 weeks until winter, $4.30. The numbers didn't work. Moen was right about that. The conventional path was closed, but there had to be another path. Her Uncle Petter's abandoned claim sat 2 miles north, past a rise where the clay bluffs gave way to rolling grassland. Thea walked there in late August, hoping to salvage anything useful: tools, timber, seeds. What she found was a prairie dog town. Hundreds of mounds stretched across the grass, some flat and low, others built up into steep-sided cones nearly 3 feet tall. The animals themselves popped up and down like living targets in a shooting gallery, their bark chirps echoing across the empty land. Thea sat down to rest in the shade of a cottonwood. The temperature was pushing 90. Even in the shade, sweat ran down her back. But the prairie dogs emerging from their burrows looked comfortable, cool even. They'd scurry out, sit upright in the sun, then disappear back underground. No panning, no heat distress. She watched for an hour, then 2. The sun moved and she moved with it, circling the town, observing. The mounds weren't random. The low flat ones, maybe 8 or 10 inches high, always seemed to have grass bending toward them when the wind blew. The tall, steep ones, 2 or 3 feet high, had grass bending away. Air was moving, into the low mounds, out of the tall ones. She thought about her father. In the old country, people built houses into hillsides. The earth kept them warm in winter, cool in summer. She thought about the root cellar back in Minnesota, how she used to climb down on hot days because it was always cool down there. 50 degrees, 55. Never changed. The prairie dogs lived underground. They survived winters that killed cattle. Their burrows had different height openings that moved air through the tunnels. The earth was always the same temperature below the frost line. What if she didn't try to heat a broken sod house? What if she went underground instead? The clay bluff behind the Solvang claim rose 60 feet from the valley floor, its south-facing slope baked hard by summer sun. Thea stood at the base with her father's mattock and drew a rectangle in the dirt with a stick. 4 feet wide, 4.5 feet tall, just big enough for her to stand hunched inside, just small enough for a 13-year-old to dig alone. She swung the mattock. Clay chips flew. By the end of the first day, she'd carved a hole 3 feet deep into the hillside. Her hands were already blistering, her shoulders burned, but she put her palm against the back wall of her little excavation and felt something that made her catch her breath. Cool. Noticeably cooler than the surface. Even 3 feet in, even in August, the clay was cool. By the end of the first week, she was 10 feet in. The temperature difference was unmistakable now. She could step from the August heat into the tunnel and feel the air change, like walking into a root cellar. She found an old mercury thermometer in the abandoned schoolhouse and borrowed it without asking. At the back of her tunnel, the clay walls registered 54 degrees. 54 degrees. In August. While the surface baked at 90. If it stayed this cool in summer, it would stay this warm in winter. The earth didn't know what season it was. Margaret Holstad was the closest thing Thea had to a friendly neighbor, a widow in her 40s who lived on the next claim over, half a mile east. She'd survived 8 Dakota winters, buried a husband and 2 children, and kept going because stopping wasn't something she knew how to do. She wasn't kind exactly, but she wasn't cruel either. And in Buford Crossing, that counted as friendship. She appeared at the tunnel entrance in early September, when Thea had dug 30 feet into the hillside. Margaret stood at the entrance, watching Thea haul out bucket after bucket of clay. "Child, what are you doing?" Thea climbed out, wiping clay-covered hands on her dress. "Building a shelter." "A shelter?" "Underground, like the prairie dogs. It's 52 degrees in there, all the way at the back. It won't change in winter." Margaret looked at the tunnel entrance like it might bite her. "You're digging because of prairie dogs. They survive winters that kill cattle. Their burrows stay warm when the surface freezes. They have 2 kinds of openings, high and low, and the wind moves air through." Thea pointed at her own excavation. "I'm going to make chambers, sleeping rooms, a place for a fire near the entrance with a chimney up through the clay, and another opening higher up so the air moves." "You're 13 years old." "I know how old I am." Margaret shook her head slowly. "You're digging your own grave," is what you're doing. A hole in the ground won't keep you warm when it's 40 below. The ground freezes 3 feet down. This tunnel of yours will be an icebox. Not if I go deep enough. Below the frost line, the ground stays the same. Come inside. Put your hand on the wall. Margaret stepped back. "I'm not going in there." "Then how do you know it won't work?" The widow's face hardened. "I've seen people die from doing what made sense to them. Your father thought he had time to finish the roof. He didn't. You think you can burrow into the earth like a gopher. You can't. You need to stop this foolishness and find a family to take you in before the snow flies." Thea picked up her mattock. "If I could cut 8 cords of wood by myself, I'd cut 8 cords of wood. I can't. If I could buy 400 pounds of flour with $4, I'd buy 400 pounds of flour. I can't. This is the only thing I can do." She turned back to the tunnel entrance. "I'll be done by November. You can come see then if you want." Margaret left without another word. Word spread through Buford Crossing the way word always spread, through the store, the church, and Clara Moen's front porch. "The Solvang girl has lost her mind. She's digging a hole in the hill like a prairie dog. Says the air's going to freeze people's lungs." That last detail came from Anders. Thea, trying to explain to her 7-year-old brother why they spent every day hauling clay, had told him about watching the prairie dogs seal their burrows before storms. "They know when bad air's coming," she'd said. "Air cold enough to freeze your lungs." Anders, proud of his sister's important knowledge, repeated this at the church gathering. By the time the story traveled through 3 more mouths, Thea had become a prophet of doom who talked to animals and predicted apocalyptic weather. The children started calling her Mole Girl. The adults were crueler. They said she was touched. The grief had broken her mind, that she'd end up in an asylum before spring. Einar Moen told anyone who would listen that he'd given the Solvang girl fair warning back in August. "Some people won't be helped," he said. "Some people have to learn the hard way." Clara Moen learned about the tunnel and decided it was her Christian duty to intervene. Clara Moen was Einar's wife, which meant she was the settlement's social arbiter the way Einar was its economic one. She organized the church socials, managed the informal charity, and decided who was deserving and who was not. Her opinions became community opinions within days of her voicing them. She arrived at the Solvang claim in mid-September, ostensibly to check on poor Kirsten. What she actually came to see was the tunnel, now 30 feet deep, properly shored with cottonwood poles, and beginning to branch into side chambers. Clara inspected the entrance with undisguised contempt. "This is what you're doing instead of preparing for winter, instead of caring for your mother, digging holes and spreading stories about magic air." "It's not magic." Thea stood at the entrance, covered in clay dust. It's just Earth. The Earth stays the same temperature below the frost line. The prairie dogs know this. Anyone can learn it by watching. The prairie dogs. Clara's laugh was sharp and short. You're taking survival advice from rodents. They survive winters that kill cattle. They're animals, child. They live in dirt because they're animals. People are not animals. People build houses. People cut firewood. People don't crawl into holes in the ground because a rodent told them to. Thea said nothing. There was nothing to say that would make a difference. Clara stepped closer, lowering her voice. My husband says your family should have left in August. I told him to give you time, that you'd come to your senses. But now I see you've gotten worse, not better. She gestured at the tunnel entrance. This is what happens when children are left without guidance. You've invented a story about magic air and animal prophets to justify digging in the dirt like a badger. Your mother lies in a stupor while you play in the mud, and your brother goes around telling people that the air is going to kill everyone. I never said the church charity is for families who help themselves. Clara's voice went cold. Not for children who dig holes and tell lies about the weather. If you want help this winter, you'll fill in this pit and start behaving like a Christian. Otherwise, you'll get nothing from us. She turned and walked away without waiting for a response. That week, the informal assistance that had trickled into the Solvang claim, a neighbor bringing leftover bread, another dropping off a worn blanket, stopped entirely. Thea was alone. $3.12 remained. The tunnel was 30 feet deep with one sleeping chamber started. 6 weeks until hard freeze, and Anders had started coughing. The days blurred into a rhythm of exhaustion. Rise before dawn. Feed Anders. Check on Kirsten, still staring at the ceiling, still barely eating, still calling Thea by her grandmother's name half the time. Then walk to the bluff and dig until her arms wouldn't lift the mattock anymore. The blisters on her hands broke and bled and broke again. She wrapped them in rags torn from her second-best dress. The rags soaked through with blood and clay. Her shoulders seized up at night so badly she couldn't sleep on her back. She dropped weight she didn't have to lose, her cheekbones sharpening, her collarbone standing out like a rope under skin. She ate 1 meal a day so Anders and Kirsten could have 2. On the days she forgot to eat at all, she didn't notice until she stood up and the world went gray at the edges. 40 feet. 50 feet. The fire chamber carved out, a shaft punched up through the clay to the surface. The draft worked. She could feel air pulling upward when she lit a test fire. The smoke rose and vanished. 60 feet. Side chambers branching off. The first sleeping alcove roughed in, just big enough for a straw-tick mattress and one body. October arrived cold. The first frost killed the remaining garden. Snow fell and melted, fell and melted. Anders' cough worsened. Then the setback. Thea was hauling a bucket of clay out of the tunnel when she heard the sound, a grinding, cracking rumble from inside. She dropped the bucket and scrambled back just as a section of ceiling near the entrance collapsed. 6 feet of tunnel gone. Timbers snapped like bones. Clay fell in chunks the size of her head. She stood at the entrance, dust billowing out, and waited for her heart to stop pounding. If she'd been inside, if she'd been directly under that section, 3 days. That's what the collapse cost her. 3 days of clearing debris, hauling out broken timbers, reshoring the damaged section with heavier poles. 3 days closer to winter while the work went backward instead of forward. 4 weeks until the ground froze too hard to dig. Still needed. Pantry chamber, final sleeping chamber, reinforcement of entrance. Anders' cough was worse. The first real cold snap was coming. She worked 16 hours the day after the collapse, 18 hours the day after that. Her hands split and bled. Her vision swam. But the tunnel grew. Margareta Holstad appeared at the tunnel entrance on a November morning, the first hard frost glittering on the grass behind her. She carried a bundle, a heavy wool blanket, a sack of dried apples, and a small jar of rendered lard. "I'm not helping you," she said immediately, "but I owe your father for mending my fence last spring. This squares the debt." Thea took the bundle. The blanket alone was worth more than everything she had left. "Thank you." Margaret didn't leave. She stood at the tunnel entrance, looking into the darkness. "Can I see inside?" Thea led her in. The tunnel extended 70 feet now, shored with cottonwood poles every 10 feet. A small fire crackled in the fire chamber, casting orange light on clay walls. The air was still, warm, dry. The contrast with the November cold outside was startling, walking from winter into a mild autumn day in 20 steps. Margaret walked to the back, past the sleeping chambers with their straw tick mattresses, past the pantry with its shelves cut directly into the clay. She put her hand on the wall at the very end of the tunnel. She stood there for a long moment. "It's warm in here," she said finally. 52 degrees. It hasn't changed since August." Margaret turned and looked at the length of the tunnel, at the chambers, the fire, the ventilation shaft, the shoring, at everything a 13-year-old girl had built alone with a mattock and buckets and hands that bled. "My sod house feels colder than this," she said, "and I've got a stove going." She walked back toward the entrance without another word. At the opening, she paused. "I still think you're wrong," she said. "But I thought you should know. I hope you're not." Then she left. November became December. Thea moved Kirsten to the tunnel on a makeshift sled, dragging her mother's skeletal body 200 yards through the snow. Kirsten didn't resist. Kirsten barely noticed. The tunnel system was finished, 75 feet of main corridor, a fire chamber that drew perfectly, 3 sleeping chambers, a pantry holding their meager supplies at a constant 52 degrees, 2 openings at different heights, creating a slow but steady airflow even when the wind died. Thea had done everything she could do. She had 40 pounds of flour, 15 pounds of beans, a small quantity of salt pork, and the dried apples from Margaret. Enough for 2 months, maybe 3, if they stretched it to the point of starvation. She had 1 cord of firewood stacked near the tunnel entrance, not for heat, but for cooking. The tunnel didn't need heating. That was the point. She walked to the prairie dog town on a December afternoon. The burrows were completely sealed, every entrance mounded over with fresh dirt, packed down, invisible. She'd never seen them do that before. Something was coming that was worse than cold. She didn't know what, but the prairie dogs knew. The old-timers were watching the sky too. Cattle ate ravenously, as if they knew they needed to store fat. Muskrats built their lodges with walls twice as thick as normal. The moon had a ring around it 3 nights in a row. "Hard winter coming," people said. "Maybe as bad as 81. But then January arrived, and the weather turned warm. The first 12 days of January 1888 brought temperatures that belonged in April. 40 degrees, 50 degrees. Snow melted, roads turned to mud. Children walked to school without coats. Farmers worked in shirt sleeves. Einar Moen was heard saying, "The Solvang girl wasted all fall digging a hole, and now look, we're not even going to need extra firewood." Clara Moen made a point of walking past the Solvang claim and observing loudly to her companion. "All that work for nothing. I wonder if she's learned anything." Thea walked to the prairie dog town, still sealed. No activity at all. She walked along the Missouri River bluffs and noticed the ice. It should have been 2 feet thick by now, but it had a dark, soft look, weakened by the thaw. A hard freeze now would be more dangerous than a steady cold winter. The rapid change itself would kill. She stocked extra firewood in the tunnel entrance. She brought all remaining food inside. She sealed the sod house and moved the last useful items underground. Anders asked, "Why are we moving everything?" "Because it's coming," she said. "The prairie dogs know." The morning of January 12th, 1888, dawned so warm that Thea stepped outside without her coat. She climbed to the top of the bluff above her tunnel and looked northwest. The sky was a perfect blue. The sun felt like spring. A meadowlark sang somewhere in the grass. Then she saw it. A line on the horizon, dark, moving. Not a cloud. Clouds didn't move that fast. This was a wall, black as coal smoke, boiling up from the earth and racing across the prairie faster than a horse could run. She'd seen thunderstorms. This was not a thunderstorm. The wall stretched from one horizon to the other, swallowing the blue sky, swallowing the sun. It made no sound yet, but she could see birds fleeing ahead of it. Hawks, prairie chickens, sparrows, all flying southeast as fast as their wings could carry them. She turned and ran for the tunnel. She was 50 feet from the entrance when the wind hit. The cold hit her like a fist. One moment she was running through mild January air, her lungs pulling easy breaths. The next moment she couldn't breathe at all. The wind came from the northwest at 50 miles an hour, carrying something that wasn't snow. It was finer than snow, finer than flour, ice dust so small it penetrated her clothing and seared her skin like fire. She stumbled. The world vanished. The tunnel entrance was 30 feet away. She'd measured the distance 100 times, but she couldn't see her hand in front of her face. The wind screamed in her ears. She tasted blood where the cold cracked her lips. 20 feet. She knew the direction. She'd walked it so many times her legs knew the path even when her eyes were useless. 10 feet. The ground sloped down here. She was close. Her shoulder hit the canvas she'd hung over the tunnel entrance. She clawed it aside and fell through, tumbling into darkness. Behind her the canvas whipped and tore. Wind howled into the tunnel, warm air rushing out, cold air flooding in. She grabbed the timber barricade she'd built for exactly this moment and shoved it into place, wedging it against the entrance frame. Not airtight, but it blocked the direct blast. Then silence. Or something like silence. The muffled roar of wind outside, but inside just the sound of her own breathing, her own heart pounding. "Thea?" Anders's voice came from deeper in the tunnel, small and scared. "I'm here." She crawled forward, feeling the temperature change with every foot, warmer, warmer, the clay walls breathing out their constant 52 degrees. "I'm here, Anders. It's all right." It wasn't all right, but she was inside, and he was inside, and their mother was inside. The tunnel had to work now. There was no other option. By nightfall, the temperature outside had fallen to 30 degrees below zero. The wind still screamed at 50 miles per hour. Thea could hear it howling around the barricade, could feel the occasional gust penetrate the gaps and send fingers of cold reaching down the corridor. But at the back of the tunnel, in the sleeping chamber where Anders and Kirsten huddled together, the temperature hadn't changed. 52 degrees. The same as August. The same as October. The same as December. The earth didn't know what season it was. The earth didn't care that the air above had become a killing thing. Thea lit a fire in the fire chamber, not for warmth, but for light and for cooking. The smoke rose obediently up the chimney shaft. She could hear the wind catching it above, pulling it away. The draft worked even in the storm, maybe especially in the storm, with the wind creating a suction. Anders sat by the fire, wrapped in Margaret's wool blanket. His cough had quieted. The warm, still air was better for his lungs than the dry cold of the sod house had ever been. "Is the storm bad?" he asked. "Yes." "How bad?" Thea thought about the wall of black she'd seen racing across the prairie. She thought about the ice dust that had burned her skin. She thought about how the air had felt in her lungs for those few seconds before she reached the entrance, like breathing broken glass. "Bad enough that we're staying in here until it stops," she said. "However long that is." The voice came in the night. Thea couldn't tell what time it was. Underground. There was no day or night. Only firelight and darkness. She dozed off in the fire chamber, exhaustion finally overwhelming vigilance. The voice woke her. Faint. Coming from outside the barricade. "Help. Please. Anyone." A woman's voice. Weak. Barely audible over the wind. Thea crawled to the barricade and pressed her ear against the timber. The voice came again, closer now, maybe 20 feet from the entrance. "Please. I can't feel my feet." Thea knew that voice. Margaret Holstad. She grabbed the rope she'd prepared, 50 feet of hemp cord anchored to a shoring pole near the entrance. She tied the other end around her waist. Then she shoved aside the barricade and stepped out into the killing air. The cold was worse than before. 40 below now, maybe colder. The wind had shifted slightly but hadn't weakened. The ice dust still flew horizontal, still penetrated everything. "Margaret!" she shouted. Her voice vanished into the wind. "Here! Over here!" Thea moved toward the sound, rope paying out behind her. 5 feet, 10 feet. The darkness was absolute. No moon, no stars, just swirling white-gray ice dust. 15 feet. Her foot struck something soft. Margaret lay curled on the ground, her coat covered in frost, her face white where it wasn't blackened by frostbite. She'd collapsed and couldn't rise. Thea grabbed her under the arms and pulled. Margaret was bigger than her, a full-grown woman, dead weight now. Thea's feet slipped on the frozen ground. She pulled again, moved her 6 inches. "You have to help me," Thea shouted over the wind. "You have to try to walk." Margaret's legs moved, not walking, pushing, but enough to help. Thea pulled while Margaret shoved, following the rope hand over hand back toward the entrance. The last 5 feet felt like 5 miles. Then they were through the barricade, and Thea was wedging it back into place, and Margaret was lying on the tunnel floor, still and white and barely breathing. But alive. Still alive. Thea dragged Margaret to the fire chamber and stripped off her frozen coat. The widow's feet were the worst, waxy white, hard as wood. Frostbitten beyond anything Thea had ever seen. She remembered something her father had said about frostbite. Don't warm it fast. Warm it slow. Fast warming burst the blood vessels. She packed Margaret's feet in the lard the widow had brought in November, cool and soft, just above freezing. Not warm, but not as cold as the feet themselves. Let the tissue thaw slowly. Margaret's eyes opened, focused, found Thea's face. "I told you, dirt hole wouldn't work." Her voice was a cracked whisper. "You're welcome," Thea said. Something that might have been a laugh came out of Margaret's throat, or a sob. It was hard to tell. My house collapsed. North wall. Wind blew right through, and the wall just came down. The same thing that would have happened to the Solvang sod house. The same reason Thea had abandoned it. "How did you find the tunnel?" "Followed the bluffs. Could feel them even when I couldn't see. Knew your place was somewhere. Kept walking until I couldn't walk anymore." Margaret closed her eyes. "I was going to die out there. I could feel it happening, and all I could think was, that stupid girl and her stupid prairie dog tunnel." "It's warm in here," Thea said. 52 degrees. Same as it was in November when you put your hand on the wall. Margaret's eyes opened again. Tears ran down her frostbitten cheeks. I should have listened to you, she whispered. I should have told people. You're alive. That's what matters right now. Others came. Odd Henriksen appeared at the barricade around what Thea guessed was midnight. A bachelor farmer from a mile north, wild-eyed and half-frozen. His sod roof had collapsed under the weight of drifting snow. He dug himself out and crawled toward the river bluffs, the only landmark he could feel in the whiteout. I saw the smoke from your chimney, he said, shaking so badly he could barely speak. Came out of nowhere, like a sign from God. Then the Baca children, 2 boys, Eric, age 11, and Martin, age 9, stumbling through the darkness, holding each other's hands. Their parents had sent them out when the stove blew out and wouldn't relight. Find the Holstad place, their father had said. It's only half a mile. But the Holstad place was gone. Its wall collapsed like all the others. The boys had kept walking, half a mile, becoming 2 miles, following the bluffs because there was nothing else to follow. Where are your parents? Thea asked, wrapping them in the remaining blankets. They were going to follow us, Eric said, after they tried the stove one more time. Thea said nothing. She didn't have to. Eric's face told her he already knew. Pastor Lindquist came last, near dawn, if dawn was what the faint lightening of the gray outside the barricade could be called. He'd been walking between homesteads when the storm hit, checking on his scattered congregation. The wind had knocked him down and spun him around until he lost all sense of direction. He'd walked in circles for hours, slowly freezing, until he stumbled against the bluff and felt his way along it to the tunnel entrance. I prayed for deliverance, he said, his voice raw, and the Lord delivered me to a hole in the ground dug by a child. The Lord has a sense of humor. 9 people now crowded the tunnel. Thea, Anders, Kirsten, Margaret with her ruined feet, Odd Henriksen still shaking, the Baca boys silent with shock, Pastor Lindquist muttering prayers under his breath. The tunnel had been designed for 8 to 10 people. It held them all. The temperature at the back chambers stayed at 52 degrees. The fire burned steady, smoke rising through the chimney, fresh air pulling in through the ventilation shaft. 9 people breathed the same air, and the 2 opening system, tall mound and short mound, just like the prairie dogs, kept it circulating. Outside, the wind howled at 50 miles per hour. The temperature fell to 47 degrees below zero. With the wind chill, it was 80 below. Inside the tunnel, 9 people waited and lived. The storm raged for 2 days. They established a rhythm in the darkness. Fire maintenance, Odd Henriksen took charge of that, feeding it small sticks to keep the draft going without wasting fuel. Food rationing, Thea's supplies had to stretch for 9 now instead of 3, so they ate once a day, small portions of beans and the dried apples from Margaret. Sleep in shifts. The sleeping chambers fit 2 people each, so they rotated, some resting while others sat by the fire. Margaret's feet were the worst medical concern. The frostbite was severe. 2 toes on her right foot had turned black. Thea kept them packed in lard, kept Margaret still, kept her from looking at what was happening to her own body. There was nothing else to be done without a doctor, and there was no doctor. The Baca boys didn't speak. They sat together, holding hands, staring at the fire. Pastor Lindquist tried to comfort them, talked about their parents being with God, talked about the mysteries of divine will. The boys didn't respond. They were waiting for parents who were never coming, and some part of them already knew it. Kirsten, strangely, improved. The steady warmth of the tunnel, the constant temperature, the presence of other people. Something stirred in her that had been dormant for months. She didn't rise. She didn't speak much, but her eyes tracked movement now, and when Anders sat with her, she stroked his hair. On the second day, Thea heard something new from outside the barricade. Not wind, silence. She shoved aside the timber frame and stepped out. The world had ended. That was her first thought. The world she'd known was simply gone. Everything was white. The sod house, invisible, buried under a drift taller than she was. The path to the river, erased, filled with snow packed hard as ice. The prairie dog town to the north, sealed under a blank white plain. But the sky was clear, blue and empty and cold. The sun sat low on the horizon, pale and distant, offering light without warmth. The temperature was still 40 below. Without wind, it felt almost warm by comparison. Thea could breathe without pain, could stand upright without being knocked down. She climbed to the top of the bluff and looked out across the valley. Nothing moved. No smoke rose from any chimney she could see. The settlement of Buford Crossing, 3 miles away, was invisible, either buried in drifts or simply too far away to see in the frozen air. Behind her, the tunnel entrance gaped dark in the hillside. Steam rose from it, warm air meeting cold, condensing into mist. She'd done it. The tunnel had worked. 9 people were alive because of a hole in the ground. But what about everyone else? The bodies were found over the following days. The Baca parents, frozen 100 yards from their own door, unable to find it in the whiteout. They'd left the house minutes after sending the boys out, and the storm had swallowed them whole. Old Jonas Knutson found standing upright, his hands wrapped around a fence post. He'd been trying to follow the fence to his barn. He'd made it a quarter mile before the cold stopped his heart. Widow Carlson found in her bed. The fire had gone out sometime in the night, and she'd simply never woken up. 3 children from the Millers Creek schoolhouse, their teacher, Lois Royce, had tried to lead them 82 yards to her boarding house when the schoolhouse fuel ran out. All 3 children froze before they arrived. Royce survived but lost both feet. In total, across Dakota Territory, Nebraska, and Minnesota, between 235 and 500 people died in what newspapers would call the children's blizzard. Cattle died by the thousands, entire herds frozen where they stood, too cold to move, too cold to breathe. Horses suffocated when the ice dust packed into their nostrils. Einar Mohn's prize milk cow was found dead, her lungs full of frozen snow. Pastor Lindquist was the first to walk to the settlement. 3 days after the storm broke, the roads were still impassable by wagon, but a man on foot could manage it if he kept to the high ground. Lindquist made the 3-mile journey in 2 hours, arriving at Buford Crossing to find half the buildings damaged, 4 people dead, and a community in shock. He told them about the tunnel. He told them about the 13-year-old girl who had dug it because she watched prairie dogs. He told them about the 52 degrees inside while the surface temperature hit 47 below. He told them about 9 people alive who should have been dead. They didn't believe him at first. Then they walked out to sea. Over the next week, nearly every surviving settler in the area visited Thea's tunnel. They ducked through the entrance and walked the 75 feet to the back, putting their hands on the clay walls, feeling the temperature that hadn't changed while the world above froze. Margareta Holstad, sitting in the fire chamber with her bandaged feet. She would lose 2 toes, but she would keep the feet themselves, told anyone who asked. I came here in November. I felt the wall. It was 52 degrees then. I didn't believe it would hold. I was wrong. Odd Henriksen, who'd seen his roof collapse and crawled through the storm to the chimney smoke, explained the ventilation. She built it like the prairie dogs, 2 openings at different heights. The wind moves the air through. It works. Pastor Lindquist called it a miracle. The Lord works through the least of us, he said. A child saw what we couldn't see. She listened to the earth when we wouldn't listen to her. Einar Moen came on the 10th day. He stood at the tunnel entrance for a long time, looking at the dark opening in the hillside. His face was unreadable. Then he ducked inside. Thea was in the fire chamber, cooking the last of the beans for the Bake boys, who still hadn't spoken, but had started eating again. She looked up as Moen appeared in the firelight. He didn't say anything at first. He walked the length of the tunnel, examining the shoring, the chambers, the ventilation shaft. He put his hand on the back wall and held it there. When he returned to the fire chamber, he looked older, or maybe just tired. "I said you'd find your brother frozen in a dirt hole," he said. "You did." Moen looked at Anders, who sat by the fire wrapped in the wool blanket, healthy, alive, pink-cheeked in the warmth. "I was wrong." Thea waited. There might be more. There was. "You should write down how you built this," Moen said. "Measurements, materials, how deep, how wide, where to put the openings. Others should know." "I already have," Moen nodded slowly. "I'll put copies in the store. People can take them." It wasn't an apology. Einar Moen didn't apologize, but it was acknowledgement. And from Einar Moen, that was close to the same thing. "Your family has a line of credit at the store," he said. "Whatever you need to get through the rest of winter. We'll settle up in spring." Thea accepted. Pride was a luxury she couldn't afford. Her family needed food, and Moen was offering it. He ducked back out of the tunnel and walked away toward the settlement. He never came back. But the copies of Thea's instructions appeared in the store that week, and people took them. By spring, 3 other families in the Buford Crossing area had begun digging their own tunnel shelters. Margrethe Holstad, unable to walk far on her damaged feet, directed construction of one into the bluff behind her rebuilt sod house. Odd Henriksen dug into a hillside a quarter-mile from his property and reinforced his new tunnel with timber salvaged from his collapsed roof. Word spread further. A newspaper in Bismarck printed a short item about the girl who built a prairie dog tunnel and sheltered 9 souls. Letters arrived asking for instructions. Thea answered every one. She drew diagrams with measurements. 4 feet wide, 4.5 feet tall, shoring every 10 feet. She explained the ventilation principle, 2 openings at different heights, the wind creating flow. She described the fire chamber placement, the chimney shaft, the sleeping alcoves cut into the side walls. She charged nothing. When people asked why, she said, "The prairie dogs didn't charge me." By winter of 1889, 11 families in Dakota Territory had dug tunnel shelters based on Thea Solvang's design. She shared the specifications freely, writing letters in careful English to everyone who asked, sketching the measurements and explaining the prairie dog ventilation principle she'd observed. She never charged a penny. The tunnels were known locally as Solvang dugouts, or simply dirt burrows. Several remained in use as storm shelters and root cellars for decades after conventional homes replaced the original sod structures. Thea Solvang remained in Dakota Territory her entire life. Her mother Kirsten recovered slowly over the following years, the tunnel, and then the house Anders eventually built on the family claim, providing the stability she needed. Kirsten lived until 1903. Anders Solvang grew up, married, and farmed the same claim where his sister had dug her first tunnel. He told the story to his children and his grandchildren, the prairie dogs, the hole in the hill, the night when 9 people lived while the world froze. Thea herself never married. She was known for decades as the woman who had saved 9 lives with a dirt hole, and as someone who still watched the prairie dogs every autumn to predict what kind of winter was coming. She died in 1941, at 87 years old, in the house Anders built on the family claim. The original tunnel entrance was still visible on the bluff behind the property, though the timbers had long since rotted. When they buried her in the family plot, next to her father, her uncle, and her mother, there was frost on the ground, and the prairie dogs had already sealed their burrows for winter. On January 12, 1888, the temperature in Dakota Territory dropped over 60 degrees in under 5 hours. The air turned so cold it killed livestock on contact. Ice dust so fine it was more like smoke than snow, penetrated every crack and buried every road and erased the world. Einar Moen, who had survived 11 Dakota winters and lost 2 fingers to the cold, had looked at a 13-year-old girl and delivered his verdict. That girl has gone simple in the head. When the real cold comes, she'll crawl out of her dirt hole and find her little brother frozen solid in there with her. The real cold came. 47 degrees below zero, wind chills of 80 below, the air that freezes lungs. Thea Solvang stayed in her dirt hole, and when it was over, her brother was alive, her mother was alive, and 7 other people who would have died on the surface were alive with them. The tunnel held 52 degrees while the world above reached 47 below. A century later, the bluff is still there. The clay is still there. If you know where to look, you can find the depression in the hillside where a 13-year-old girl once spent 4 months digging her way down to where the earth doesn't know what season it is. The prairie dogs still seal their burrows before the worst storms come. Thea Solvang proved they knew what they were doing.